power isn't just about money. It's about the chilling belief that you can own people. In the glittering world of old money dynasties, some believe their wealth gives them the right to play God with the lives of others. Tonight, we enter the magnificent ballroom of billionaire Alistair Blackwood, a man whose name was a synonym for influence. Amidst the clinking of champagne glasses and whispered pleasantries, he decided to make his black maid, Ilara Vance, the evening's entertainment. He pointed a diamond-cuffed finger and ordered her to sing for his amused guests. He expected a spectacle of humiliation. What he got was a reckoning that shattered his world and silenced a room full of the most powerful people on the East Coast. This is the story of how a single song became a declaration of war. The air in the Blackwood Estate's grand ballroom was thick with the scent of money. It wasn't the crisp, clean smell of new bills, but the aged, complex aroma of generational wealth, a blend of expensive French perfume, rare hothouse lilies, and the faint, almost metallic tang of ambition that clung to the tuxedos and silk gowns. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto the polished marble floors, making the diamond necklaces and sapphire earrings on the guests glitter like constellations brought down to earth. This was the annual Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala, the pinnacle of the Greenwich, Connecticut social calendar, and its king, Alistair Blackwood, surveyed his domain from the top of the grand staircase. He was a man carved from granite and arrogance, with a sharp jaw, silvering hair brushed back from his temples, and eyes the color of a winter sky, cold, clear, and judging. At his side, his wife Isabella was a portrait of fragile elegance, her smile as carefully maintained as the priceless Vermeer hanging in the West Wing. Down below, weaving through the titans of industry, the political brokers and the vapid socialites, was Ilara Vance. In her simple, impeccably starched black uniform with a white apron, she was designed to be invisible. Her job was to be a silent ghost, refilling a champagne flute here, removing an empty canapé plate there, her presence felt but never truly seen. She moved with a quiet efficiency that belied the storm of observation raging within her. She saw the desperation in a young stockbroker's eyes as he pitched to a senator. She heard the veiled insult Genevieve Dupont, a banking heiress, leveled at a rival's gown. She felt the oppressive weight of a world she served but could never join. Ilara, at 24, had shoulders that carried more than just serving trays. They carried the weight of her mother's mounting medical bills, the memory of a father who'd died too young, and the ghost of a dream she'd long since packed away, a scholarship to Juilliard, forfeited to become the primary breadwinner. Her world had shrunk to the pristine, soulless halls of the Blackwood estate, where her days were governed by the whims of its master. Alistair Blackwood had a particular kind of cruelty, one that was patient and precise. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His power lay in his ability to dismantle a person's dignity with a single quiet sentence. He'd once made the head gardener, a man who had worked on the estate for 40 years, dig up and replant an entire rose garden because the shade of pink offended his aesthetic. He'd forgotten to provide a reference for a chauffeur, effectively ending the man's career over a perceived slight. Tonight he was in rare form, buoyed by the fawning sycophants who surrounded him. The orchestra had just finished a soaring Vivaldi piece, and a polite, restrained applause filled the room. Alistair raised a hand, and the room fell into a respectful hush. "Thank you, he said, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that carried effortlessly across the cavernous space. "It warms my heart to see you all here, supporting the Foundation's work. It is in the spirit of giving, of lifting up those less fortunate that we gather." Ilara, standing near a marble column, felt a bitter taste rise in her throat. Lifting up the less fortunate. He paid her the absolute minimum wage allowed by state law. Alistair's gaze swept the room, and for a terrifying second, it landed on her. A slow, predatory smile spread across his lips. It was the kind of smile that signaled he was about to play one of his games. In fact, he continued, his voice taking on a performative theatrical tone, I believe in nurturing hidden talents wherever one might find them. He didn't break eye contact with Ilara. Our staff, for instance, so loyal, so diligent, and sometimes full of surprises. A nervous titter went through the crowd. They could sense the shift in the atmosphere. This was no longer a charity speech. It was a show. Ilara, he called out. Her name spoken by him in this setting felt like a violation. Every head in the ballroom swiveled to face her. Hundreds of pairs of eyes, curious, disdainful, pitying, pinned her to the spot. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Come here. It was an order, not an invitation. Her training, her very survival, screamed at her to obey. She placed her silver tray on a nearby table, her hands trembling slightly, and walked the long, lonely expanse of marble. Each step felt like a mile, the silence broken only by the rustle of silk and the soft click of her sensible black shoes. She stopped a few feet from the staircase, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet his gaze. I've been told, Alistair said, leaning forward conspiratorially, as if sharing a charming secret with his guests, that you have a voice, that you sing. Is this true, Ilara? She couldn't speak. She just gave a short, jerky nod. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crept up her neck and burned her cheeks. He knew she sang. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, had once heard her humming to herself in the laundry room, and had foolishly mentioned it to Isabella, who had then even more foolishly mentioned it to Alistair. A piece of personal information, now weaponized. Wonderful! Alistair boomed, clapping his hands together. Then you shall entertain us. A real, authentic performance. A spiritual, perhaps. Isn't that what your people sing? The racial undertone was as sharp and ugly as a shard of broken glass. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to speak. To challenge Alistair Blackwood in his own home was social suicide. Isabella Blackwood laid a delicate hand on her husband's arm. Alistair, darling, perhaps this isn't the time. He brushed her off without a glance. Nonsense, my dear. It's the perfect time. He looked back down at Ilara, his eyes glinting with malicious delight. The orchestra is tired. The people crave something. Raw. So sing for us, Ilara. Sing. The order hung in the air, absolute and inescapable. Her mind raced. She could refuse. She could turn and walk out, sacrificing her job, her mother's only lifeline. Or she could submit, swallow her pride, and endure this public crucifixion. As she stood there, frozen in the crosshairs of 1,000 unsympathetic eyes, a third option, a terrifying and defiant thought, began to smoulder in the deepest part of her soul. The silence that followed Alistair's command was not empty. It was a living, breathing entity, filled with 100 different tensions. It was the crackling silence of a lightning storm about to break. Ilara could feel the weight of every stare dissecting her, judging her. She saw Genevieve Dupont whisper something to the man beside her, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. She saw others looking away their discomfort, a testament to their cowardice. She saw Isabella Blackwood's face, pale, and strained her eyes, pleading with Ilara to just comply to make it all go away. And she saw Alistair basking in the power of the moment. He had created this. He had bent the entire room to his will, focusing all its energy on the humiliation of one insignificant maid. For him, this was the ultimate display of dominance, more potent than any business deal or stock market conquest. Ilara's world narrowed to the space between her pounding heart and her constricted throat. Her first instinct was pure animal fear. Run, flee this gilded zoo and its heartless zookeeper. The thought was so powerful she could almost feel her muscles coiling to bolt. But then the image of her mother Sarah surfaced in her mind. Her mother, lying in a sterile hospital bed, her breath catching in a faint wheeze, dependent on the insurance provided by this very job. Running wasn't an option, so compliance was the only way. She could sing something simple, something short. Amazing Grace. Maybe. Get it over with. Endure the pitying applause, the smug look on Alistair's face, and then retreat back into the shadows where she belonged. But as she opened her mouth to meekly acquiesce, something else rose up within her. It was a memory, warm and resonant, of her grandmother Delia. Delia, whose hands were always dusted with flour, and whose voice could make the rafters of their little church in Baton Rouge tremble. Delia, a woman who cleaned the houses of rich white families by day and sang the blues in smoky hidden clubs by night. Your voice, Sherry. Delia used to tell her voice, a low musical hum. It's not just for you. It's a vessel. It carries the stories of all the women who came before you. The ones who sang in the fields, the ones who sang in the churches, the ones who sang to hush their babies in a world that didn't want them. Don't you ever let anyone make your song small. Don't you ever let anyone make your song small. The words echoed in Ilara's mind, a sudden reinforcement to her crumbling spine. What was Alistair doing if not trying to make her and her song small? He wanted a spiritual. He wanted a caricature, a performance of subservience that would affirm his place in the universe and hers. He wanted the song of a servant. He was not going to get it. The fear didn't vanish, but it transmuted into something else. It became fuel. A cold, clear anger settled over her, sharpening her senses. She lifted her head, her gaze rising from the floor, past the sneering faces in the front row, past the weak-willed onlookers, until it met Alistair Blackwood's. For the first time that night, she truly looked at him. She saw past the billion-dollar portfolio and the tailored tuxedo. She saw a small man, a man whose sense of self was so fragile it had to be constantly propped up by the debasement of others. And in that moment, she was no longer afraid of him. She took a slow, deliberate breath, letting it fill her lungs, centering herself, just as her grandmother had taught her. She didn't need an orchestra. The silence in the room was her conductor's baton. The guests leaned in, anticipating a trembling, timid voice. Genevieve Dupont held a champagne flute to her lips, her eyes alight with condescending amusement. Alistair Blackwood crossed his arms, a supremely satisfied smirk on his face. The show was about to begin. Ilara closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She wasn't in a ballroom in Connecticut anymore. She was on a rickety porch with her grandmother, the air thick with the smell of magnolia and summer rain, listening to a song Delia had written herself. A song of sorrow and resilience, and a river of souls flowing toward a freedom they couldn't yet see. She opened her eyes. She looked directly at Alistair Blackwood, and then she sang. No sound came out at first, just the quiet intake of breath. Then a single note, low and mournful, unfurled into the silent room. It was not the timid wavering sound the crowd expected. It was a note as rich and dark as delta soil, a sound that seemed to rise not just from her lungs, but from the very floor beneath her feet. It was filled with a resonant power that vibrated in the air, making the fine crystal on the tables hum in sympathy. The song was not amazing grace. It was not a familiar spiritual designed to soothe and comfort, and it was a raw blues-infused lament, a piece of music that felt ancient and immediate all at once. It was her grandmother Delia's song, River of Souls. My feet are tired, O Lord, my feet are tired, walking on this road of glass and fire. Her voice was a smoky contralto, gliding over the notes with an instinctive heartbreaking grace. Each word was perfectly enunciated, a story in itself. The initial shock in the room began to morph into something else. The whispers died. The condescending smirks froze and melted away. Genevieve Dupont lowered her champagne glass, her mouth slightly agape. Ilara's posture had changed. She was no longer the hunched, invisible servant. She stood tall, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her body a conduit for the music pouring out of her. She wasn't performing for them. She was bearing witness. They build their homes of pearl and gilded stone and leave us just the dust and barren bone. The lyrics were a direct indictment, a quiet roar against the very opulence that surrounded her. She wasn't just singing a song. She was telling her truth, her family's truth, in the heart of the empire that had profited from it. Her gaze remained locked on Alistair Blackwood, turning his own stage into her tribunal. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a tightening of his jaw. The amusement in his eyes had curdled into disbelief, then a flicker of something he hadn't felt in this room before a loss of control. As the melody swelled, Ilara's voice opened up, shedding its mournful quality for a soaring, defiant power. She sang of a river, a metaphorical current of tears and prayers from generations of her people, a river that was slowly, inexorably rising, destined to wash away the foundations of the great stone houses. But there's a river running deep, carrying the promises they couldn't keep. And that old river lord, it's gonna rise and mirror the fire from 1,000 angry eyes. The power in her voice was staggering. It filled every corner of the vast ballroom, seeming to push against the very walls. The orchestra members who had been packing away their instruments had stopped their faces, a mixture of professional analysis and pure awe. The waiters and other staff stood frozen in the doorways, their expressions a mix of terror and fierce, burgeoning pride. Sitting at a table near the back, a man who had remained aloof from the evening's social machinations leaned forward, his full attention captured. This was Julian Croft, a legendary music producer from New York City. He was only here as a favor to a client, and he'd been bored to tears all evening. He'd seen Alistair's cruel game begin, and had felt a familiar pang of disgust. Now he was listening with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. He wasn't just hearing a pretty voice, he was hearing a signature. He heard the phrasing of Billie Holiday, the raw power of Etta James, the soul of Nina Simone. But the texture, the story that was entirely new. It was authentic. It was a $1 million voice. As Ilara reached the song's crescendo, her voice climbed higher and higher, a note of pure unadulterated pain and hope that seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, shimmering like heat haze. It was a sound that stripped away the veneer of the evening, laying bare the raw, ugly truth of the power dynamic in the room. It was a cry for justice, a declaration of existence. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The last note faded, leaving behind a silence more profound, more absolute than the one that had preceded it. For a full 5 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The entire ballroom, filled with some of the most powerful and articulate people in the country, was utterly, completely, and reverently silent. They had come expecting to witness a humiliation. They had instead witnessed a revelation. Alistair Blackwood's face was a mask of cold fury. His game had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. He had tried to showcase a songbird in a cage, and she had transformed into an eagle before his very eyes. She had used his own stage to shame him, to hold a mirror up to his and everyone else's ugliness. The spell was finally broken by a single sound. From the back of the room, Julian Croft began to applaud. It wasn't the polite rhythmic clap of the gala. It was a slow, deliberate, appreciative ovation. Another person joined in, then another and another. Within seconds, the room was filled with a thunderous, rolling wave of applause, an astonished and genuine tribute that shook the very chandeliers. Elara stood breathing heavily, the adrenaline coursing through her. She looked at the sea of faces, no longer hostile, but stunned and admiring. She had found her voice. But as she looked at Alistair, Blackwood's face contorted with rage, she knew she had also just started a war. The applause crashed over Elara, a disorienting roar that felt more like a physical force than a sound. For a moment, she was dizzy, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of the room's energy. Just minutes ago, these people had been complicit in her humiliation. Now they were on their feet, their faces alight with an excitement they usually reserved for a market windfall. They weren't applauding her, she realized with a cold clarity. They were applauding the drama, the unexpected spectacle. She was still, and would always be, just entertainment. Her gaze cut through the crowd to Alistair. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. The applause was a direct affront to him, an erosion of his absolute authority. This was his house, his party, his maid. She had stolen his power, and his eyes promised a retribution that would be swift and severe. Isabella stood beside him, her hand over her mouth, her expression a complex mixture of fear for Elara and a sliver of undeniable triumphant pride. Elara knew she couldn't stay. To remain here, to accept their applause, would be to tacitly accept the rules of their game. She had sung her truth. Now she had to live it. With a final defiant look at Alistair, she turned her back on the astonished crowd and walked not with the hurried shuffle of a servant, but with the measured, dignified stride of an artist leaving a stage. She pushed through the swinging doors to the kitchen, where the air was hot and thick with the smell of cooking. The other staff members, cooks, waiters, fellow maids parted for her, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. They had all heard. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, rushed toward her. "Elara, child, what have you done?" She whispered, her hands fluttering nervously. "He will ruin you." "He can't ruin what he doesn't own, Mrs. Gable," Elara replied, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. She untied the strings of her apron and folded it neatly, placing it on the stainless steel counter. It was a final symbolic act of severing her ties. "I'm leaving." Before Mrs. Gable could protest, a man in a tailored Brioni suit appeared at the kitchen door. It was Julian Croft. He had followed her. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice calm and respectful, a stark contrast to the entitled tones she was used to. "My name is Julian Croft." Elara recognized the name. She'd seen it on the back of albums her grandmother owned, classic jazz and blues records. He was a kingmaker in the music industry. "That was the most incredible performance I've seen in a decade," he said, his eyes scanning her face, looking for the artist behind the uniform. "The song. Who wrote that?" "My grandmother," Elara said softly. Julian nodded slowly, as if that made perfect sense. "Genius runs in the family, I see. Miss Vance, I don't mean to be forward at a time like this, but a voice like yours doesn't come along once in a generation. It comes along once, period. I want to offer you a recording contract. A real one. With my label Vanguard Records. He pulled a business card from his jacket pocket. The simple, elegant card felt impossibly heavy in her hand. It was a lifeline, a future. For a moment, a dizzying wave of hope washed over her. But the kitchen door swung open again this time with a violent bang. Alistair Blackwood stood there, his face a thundercloud of controlled rage. 2 security guards flanked him. The festive atmosphere of the party was a world away. Croft Alistair snarled his voice, low and dangerous. "This is a private staff area, and you are speaking to my employee." "She was just leaving Mr. Blackwood," Julian said smoothly, stepping slightly to position himself between Alistair and Ilara. "And I believe we were discussing her future employment." Alistair let out a short, humorless laugh. "Her future. Let me tell you about her future." He took a step forward, his cold eyes boring into Ilara. "You think you can embarrass me in my own home, in front of my own guests, and walk away with a record deal? You think this is a fairy tale?" He lowered his voice, so only Ilara and Julian could hear. The veneer of the civilized billionaire was gone, replaced by the street brawler he was at his core. "Your father, Daniel Vance, he worked for me too, a driver, a thief. He stole from me a considerable amount before he had the good grace to drink himself into an early grave." Ilara flinched as if struck. Her father, a thief. The story she'd always been told was that he died in a car accident. The debt he left behind. Alistair continued his words like ice picks. "Is substantial. Your employment here was a special arrangement, a way for you to slowly, very slowly pay it off. You don't quit on me, Ilara. I own that debt." And by extension, his lips curled into a cruel smile. "I own you." This was the twist of the knife. Her servitude wasn't just a job. It was a form of indentured servitude she hadn't even been aware of. Her father, the man she barely remembered but had always idealized, had been caught in Blackwood's web too. "You have no proof of any debt." Julian Croft interjected, his voice sharp with authority. "That sounds like an accusation you wouldn't want to have to substantiate in court." "I have a signed confession from the man himself." Alistair lied, with practiced ease, his eyes never leaving Ilara's. "You walk out that door, and I will not only sue your family for every penny, I will press charges posthumously. I will drag your father's name through the mud. I will have your mother evicted from her nursing home by the end of the week. I will attach your wages for the rest of your life. No record label will touch you when you're mired in that kind of scandal. You will sing, yes, but you'll be singing on a street corner for spare change." Every word was a perfectly aimed blow designed to crush the hope that had just begun to bloom. He wasn't just threatening her future. He was threatening to poison her past and destroy her present. The ballroom, the song, the applause, it all felt like a distant dream. This was the cold, hard reality. The cage was smaller and stronger than she had ever imagined. The days that followed the gala were a descent into a suffocating silence. Ilara didn't go back to the Blackwood estate. She couldn't. But Alistair's threat hung over her like a shroud. She called the nursing home where her mother, Sarah, was staying. The administrator was polite but firm. The next payment was due, and without it, they couldn't guarantee her mother's bed. The insurance policy through Blackwood Enterprises was, of course, already cancelled. Ilara felt trapped in a nightmare. The memory of her triumphant song was now tainted, a fleeting moment of defiance that had seemingly cost her everything. She sat in her small, sparsely furnished apartment, Julian Croft's business card on her table. It represented a world of impossible opportunity, but Alistair's threats were a wall she couldn't see a way to climb. How could she build a future when her past was a debt and her present was a crisis? She finally found the courage to call the number on the card. Julian Croft answered on the second ring. He listened patiently as she explained the situation, her voice cracking as she recounted Alistair's story about her father and the fabricated debt. "Alistair is a snake. Ilara and snakes live on lies," Julian said, his voice a calm anchor in her storm. "A posthumous lawsuit over an unsubstantiated debt with a supposed confession no one has ever seen. It's a scare tactic. He's trying to psychologically paralyze you because he knows he can't touch your talent." "But he can touch my mother," Ilara whispered the words tasting like ash. "He can ruin my father's memory." "Only if you let him," Julian replied. "We fight back. Not in his arena of dirty money and legal threats. We fight in ours. With music. With the truth." Julian's belief in her was a flicker of light in the darkness. He immediately wired her a personal loan enough to cover her mother's expenses for the next 3 months and her own rent. "Consider it an advance," he said, refusing any discussion of repayment. "An investment in my new artist." His first move was to book her a small, unpublicized gig at a legendary jazz club in Greenwich Village called the Blue Note. The plan was simple: get her in front of a real audience, create a buzz and record it. But Alistair Blackwood's reach was long. 2 days before the show, the club owner called Julian full of apologies. The gig was cancelled. He wouldn't say why, but the reason was clear pressure. A major investor in the club's parent restaurant group had ties to Blackwood. They tried another venue, a smaller independent spot in Brooklyn. The same thing happened. A sudden scheduling conflict. Then a third booking was mysteriously lost. Alistair wasn't just trying to ruin her. He was trying to erase her to ensure the voice that had shamed him would never be heard again. He was blacklisting her before her career had even begun. Despair began to set in. Ilara found herself doubting everything. Maybe Alistair was right. Maybe she was foolish to think she could escape her station. She visited her mother, who was weak but lucid. "You look so tired, baby," Sarah said, her hand cool on Ilara's. "Is everything all right at that big house?" Ilara couldn't bring herself to tell her mother she'd lost the job, that they were on the brink of disaster. She just smiled and squeezed her hand. "Everything's fine, Mama. Just working hard." That night, going through a box of her mother's old things, looking for documents, she found it. Tucked away in a faded floral box was a small leather-bound journal. It was her father's. His handwriting was neat, his entries short and sporadic. Most of it was mundane notes about his driving schedule, observations about the weather. But as she got closer to the end, the entries changed. October 12th. Mr. B had me drive him to a meeting downtown, not to the office, some warehouse by the docks, men with hard eyes. He had me carry a briefcase in. It felt heavy, too heavy. October 19th, another late-night trip. He told me to wait in the car, heard shouting. He came back pale, told me if anyone ever asks, we were at the Carlisle all night. November 5th. He knows I know. He saw it in my eyes today. He called me into his study, didn't yell, just smiled that cold smile. Said I was a good driver, said my family was a good family, said he hoped we'd all stay healthy. It wasn't a hope, it was a threat. The final entry, dated just 2 days before his death, made her blood run cold. November 21st. He gave me a package, told me to hold on to it. Insurance, he called it. For him. Said I owed him for my loyalty. It's not a debt of money he holds over me. It's a debt of silence. I can't do this. This isn't me. I have to tell Sarah. He never got the chance. His car accident had been a single-car crash on a deserted road. No witnesses. The police had ruled it an accident likely due to drunk driving, but Ilara knew now with chilling certainty that it hadn't been an accident. Her father wasn't a thief. He was a witness. Alistair hadn't been leveraging a financial debt. He'd been leveraging a murder. The fabricated story of theft was a cruel masterpiece, a way to ensure her father's name was too tarnished for anyone to believe him even in death, and a chain to bind his daughter in servitude. The fear she had felt was replaced by a righteous, burning fury. This was no longer just about her career, about a song. It was about her father's name. It was about justice. She picked up the phone and called Julian. "Alistair's right," she said, her voice hard as steel. "I do have a debt to pay. I'm going to pay back every lie he ever told with interest." The discovery of her father's journal changed the equation entirely. They weren't just fighting a billionaire's spite anymore. They were confronting a potential murderer's conspiracy. Julian Croft, for all his industry connections, knew they were in dangerous territory. Going to the police with a decades-old journal and no concrete evidence was a fool's errand. Alistair would bury them in legal proceedings and paint her as a disgruntled, fame-hungry ex-employee. "He controls the narrative because he controls the traditional outlets," Julian said, pacing his sleek Manhattan office. "The venues, the papers he has shares in the networks whose CEOs play golf with him. So we can't use his stage. We have to build our own." The plan they hatched was both terrifyingly simple and brilliantly modern. They were going to bypass the gatekeepers entirely. They wouldn't fight Alistair with lawyers or investigators. They would fight him with the one weapon he couldn't counter, Ilara's voice and her father's truth. Julian called in a favor from a documentary filmmaker. He knew a young woman named Lena who specialized in raw, verite-style storytelling. They didn't book a studio. Instead, they chose a location with a soul, an abandoned church in Harlem, its stained glass windows cracked, but still beautiful dust motes dancing in the shafts of afternoon light. There was no orchestra, no fancy microphone set up. Just Ilara, a single stool, and an old piano played by a seasoned blues musician Julian trusted implicitly. Lena filmed with a single handheld camera, circling slowly, capturing the raw emotion on Ilara's face. Ilara sang "River of Souls" again. But this time it was different. It wasn't just a song of generational sorrow. It was a deeply personal eulogy for her father. Her voice, richer and more resonant with the weight of her new knowledge, filled the empty church, bouncing off the peeling plaster and soaring into the vaulted ceiling. She poured every ounce of her grief, her anger, and her love for the father she barely knew into the performance. When she finished, there wasn't applause, just a heavy, reverent silence. Even the hardened camera woman had tears in her eyes. But this was only half of their strategy. The performance was the heart, but they still needed the sword. And for that, they found an unexpected and unlikely ally. Isabella Blackwood had been living in her own silent hell since the night of the gala. The sight of Ilara's defiance had awakened a part of her she thought had long since died. Alistair's cruelty that night and his subsequent obsession with destroying the young woman had finally fractured her gilded cage. She knew about Alistair's secrets. She didn't know the details of Daniel Vance's death, but she knew about the briefcases, the late-night meetings, the fear she'd seen in the driver's eyes. She had lived with the man's darkness for 30 years. Risking everything, Isabella made an anonymous call to a fiercely independent investigative journalist. Julian knew a woman named Clara Reed, who had a reputation for taking down powerful men. Isabella didn't have her husband's journal, but she had something else. Alistair, in his arrogance, liked to record his phone calls and meetings. He called it keeping a record. His wife knew the password to the cloud account where the files were stored. Among the gigabytes of data, they found it a recording of the phone call Alistair had made the day after the gig at the Blue Note was cancelled. It was a conversation with the club's majority owner. Alistair's voice was unmistakable, laced with venomous satisfaction. "Make sure she doesn't get a stage anywhere in this city or any other. The girl needs to learn her place. I don't care what it costs. Bury her." This was the proof. The malice was clear, the conspiracy to destroy her livelihood undeniable. On a Tuesday morning, they launched their two-pronged attack. The video, titled simply, "Elara Vance, River of Souls Live at St. Michael's," was uploaded to YouTube and Vimeo. Julian used his considerable network of contacts, musicians, critics, influencers to share the link with a single message. Listen to this. Just listen. Simultaneously, Clara Reed published her bombshell article on her widely read news site. The headline was explosive. "Billionaire Alistair Blackwood accused of blacklisting extortion and a decades-old cover-up." The article featured an embedded audio clip of Alistair's phone call and detailed the story of Daniel Vance, referencing a family journal that painted a dark picture of his final days. It told the story of Elara not as a maid, but as the daughter of a man who knew too much. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The video of Elara's performance went viral. People were captivated first by the voice, a singular once-in-a-lifetime talent. The stark, beautiful setting and the raw emotion of the performance were mesmerizing. Then they read the article. The narrative Alistair had tried so desperately to control was ripped from his grasp. The story wasn't about a maid who got a lucky break. It was about a powerful predator, a grieving daughter, and a song of truth that refused to be silenced. The comment section of the video exploded. The article was shared hundreds of thousands of times. The duet of defiance, Elara's song, and Clara's journalism created a perfect storm of public outrage. Alistair Blackwood woke up a king and went to bed a pariah. The world had heard Elara sing, but now they were also listening to her story, and it was a story that could no longer be buried. The digital storm broke, not as a wave, but as a global tsunami. The video of Elara singing in the abandoned Harlem church, juxtaposed with the damning truths of Clara Reed's article, created a vortex of public fascination and fury that Alistair Blackwood could never have anticipated. His name, once a symbol of untouchable power, became a byword for corporate evil and aristocratic cruelty overnight. Blackwood Gate wasn't just a scandal, it was a cultural reckoning. Alistair's implosion was a spectacle of karmic justice. He first learned of the catastrophe not from a trusted aide, but from the frantic shouting of his head of security as a swarm of news vans descended upon the gates of his Greenwich estate like vultures to a fresh kill. Inside the palatial rooms that once echoed with deferential whispers were now filled with the incessant, maddening ringing of a dozen phone lines. He watched himself on a cable news panel, his meticulously crafted public image being dissected and flayed by pundits who just a week earlier would have begged for a spot at his gala. They used words like sociopath, predator, and a festering symbol of unchecked privilege. The first official blow came during an emergency board meeting for Blackwood Enterprises, held via a sterile video conference. The faces of the board members' men he had made, rich men who had vacationed on his yacht and laughed at his cruel jokes, were grim masks of self-preservation. "Alistair, the stock has dropped 37% since the market opened," said Marcus Thorne, the board's vice-chairman, his voice devoid of its usual sycophancy. "Our brand partners are invoking morals clauses. The foundation's key donors are pulling their pledges en masse. This is a 5-alarm fire." "It's a media frenzy." Alistair snapped his voice, a low growl. "Manufactured outrage by a nobody and a muckraking journalist. We release a statement, we sue for defamation, and we ride it out." A younger board member, a tech billionaire named Owen Vance, No relation to Ilara, a fact that was a source of endless bitter irony, for Alistair scoffed audibly. "Sue on what grounds, Alistair, your voice is on tape orchestrating a blacklist? That's not defamation, that's evidence. The court of public opinion has already reached its verdict, and we're being sentenced right alongside you." One by one, they abandoned him. They spoke of fiduciary duty of shareholder value of protecting the company. What they meant was protecting themselves. By the end of the hour-long call, the board had voted unanimously. Alistair Blackwood was to take an indefinite leave of absence from the company his grandfather had founded. He was out. He slammed his laptop shut with such force that the screen cracked, severing the connection to the men who had just surgically excised him from his own life. Days later, 2 sober-faced detectives from the Connecticut State Police arrived at his door with a warrant. They were reopening the cold case of Daniel Vance. As they questioned him in his cavernous library surrounded by the leather-bound books he'd never read, Alistair maintained a facade of bored arrogance. But as they presented him with a copy of Daniel's journal, pointing out the entries that directly contradicted his whereabouts on the nights leading up to the accident, a flicker of genuine fear entered his cold eyes. The ghost of a man he'd dismissed as insignificant was back, and this time he had a voice. Perhaps the most devastating betrayal came from Isabella. She didn't scream or cry. Her rebellion was as quiet and sharp as a stiletto. She had her lawyers serve him with divorce papers at his now former office, a public humiliation he knew she had orchestrated with precision. Her statement to the press was a masterpiece of condemnation, through charity pledging her future to a foundation that would fight men exactly like him. She was erasing him, not just from her future, but from her past, recasting her 30 years as his wife as the backstory to her own liberation. Alistair was left to rattle around his gilded cage, a king with no subjects, no power, and no one to hear him roar. The silence in the mansion was absolute. For Ilara, the silence was shattered. Her life became a whirlwind of sound and motion. The video of River of Souls became a viral sensation, climbing to 50 million views. It was more than a hit. It was a phenomenon. Her raw, soul-stirring voice, coupled with the incredible backstory, made her the most talked-about new artist on the planet. Julian Croft became her shield and her guide through the bewildering maze of sudden fame. He fielded the hundreds of offers from daytime talk shows to movie deals and multi-million-dollar endorsement contracts for products she'd never use. "The world wants to consume your story, Ilara," he told her in his calm, steadying voice. "Our job is to make sure they do it on your terms. We are not in the business of selling your trauma. We are in the business of sharing your art." Her first major interview was with Gayle King, a journalist known for her empathy and sharp intellect. On national television, sitting under the hot studio lights, Ilara was terrified. But as she began to speak, she found a new kind of strength. She told her story not with anger, but with a profound, unshakable dignity. She spoke of her grandmother's legacy, of her father's quiet goodness, and of the music that had been her sanctuary. She didn't focus on Alistair. She focused on the system that allowed men like him to flourish in the shadows. When Gayle asked her what she wanted people to take from her experience, Ilara's answer was simple. "I want them to listen," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Not just to me, but to the quiet voices in their own lives. The people who clean their offices, serve their food, care for their children. There are stories and songs everywhere in everyone. You just have to be willing to hear them." The public response was overwhelming. Letters and emails poured into Vanguard records. A woman wrote about leaving her abusive husband after hearing River of Souls, saying it gave her the courage to believe in her own strength. A young man wrote that he was inspired to reconnect with his estranged father. Ilara's song had become a catalyst, an anthem for the unseen and unheard. The recording studio became her true sanctuary. Julian assembled a team of legendary session musicians, veterans who had played with giants like Aretha Franklin and Ray Charles. They treated her not as a viral sensation, but as a peer, an artist of immense talent. The album, which she titled River of Souls, was a deeply personal project. She recorded her grandmother's songs, meticulously arranging them to honor their roots, while infusing them with her own experience. She included a haunting, stripped-down version of Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. The spiritual Alistair had so cruelly suggested reclaiming it and filling it with a depth of emotion that was almost unbearable. There were moments of difficulty. During one session, while recording a song her father used to hum, she broke down, the grief and the weight of it all becoming too much. She fled the recording booth, gasping for air. Julian followed her not with platitudes, but with quiet understanding. "Your voice carries a lot of weight, Ilara," he said, gently handing her a glass of water. "Your father's story, your grandmother's your own. It's okay to get tired of carrying it sometimes. Just remember you're not carrying it alone anymore." The most important part of her new life, however, took place far from the cameras and microphones. She used the first significant portion of her advance to move her mother Sarah into a sun-drenched private care facility overlooking the Hudson River. It wasn't just about the quality of the medical care, it was about restoring her mother's dignity. The day she finally told Sarah the full story of Daniel Vance, sharing the contents of his journal, the truth of his death, and how his name had been vindicated, her mother listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. It was a moment of shared sorrow and profound release. "I always knew," Sarah whispered, clutching Ilara's hand. "In my heart, I always knew he was a good man. The world just didn't want to see it." She looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with a fierce, burning pride. "He's seeing it now, Ilara. Through you. His song is finally being heard." 6 months after that fateful night at the gala, Ilara Vance stood in the hallowed wings of Carnegie Hall. The 3-night engagement had sold out in under an hour. A palpable buzz filled the air, an energy that was part concert anticipation and part historical event. She was no longer Ilara Vance, the maid. She was Ilara Vance, the artist, a name that now stood for resilience, truth, and the redemptive power of music. Dressed in a simple floor-length gown of deep sapphire velvet that seemed to drink the light, she felt a universe away from the starched black and white uniform that had been her cage. Backstage, Julian handed her a cup of tea. He looked at her, his professional admiration mingled with a deep paternal pride. "Hear that?" he said, tilting his head toward the stage. The roar of the crowd was a physical presence, a wave of sound that vibrated through the floorboards. "That's for you. All of it." Ilara closed her eyes, taking a slow, calming breath. She thought of Alistair Blackwood, now a recluse, his name and photograph splashed across tabloids as he was officially charged with obstruction of justice and witness tampering in her father's case. She thought of Isabella, who had sent her a single beautiful gardenia on opening night with a card that simply read, "Thank you." She thought of her grandmother Delia, whose songs had been her armor and her inheritance. And she thought of her father Daniel, a quiet man cornered by a monster, whose final defiant act of keeping a journal had planted the seeds of justice that she was now able to harvest. She was not nervous. The fear had been burned out of her, long ago cauterized in the fire of public humiliation and private grief. What she felt instead was a profound sense of gratitude, a peaceful readiness. The journey had been a trial by fire, but it had forged her into the woman she now was. "Ready?" Julian asked. She opened her eyes, and a radiant smile bloomed on her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated freedom. "More than ready," she replied. She walked from the shadows of the wings into the blazing warmth of the stage lights. The entire auditorium rose to its feet, the applause not just thunderous, but deeply emotional. It was a welcome, a coronation, and a thank you all in one. Thousands of faces, a diverse tapestry of humanity, looked up at her with reverence and love. She walked to the center of the stage, gave a slight bow to her band, and stepped up to the microphone. The hall fell into a pin-drop silence, a silence of pure, breathless anticipation, so different from the oppressive, judgmental silence of the Blackwood Ballroom. This was a sacred silence, a canvas waiting for the first stroke of color. She didn't begin with River of Souls. She began with a song no one had ever heard before, an original she had written just weeks ago. It was a simple, quiet melody, accompanied only by a gentle acoustic guitar. It was a song of forgiveness. Not for the men who had wronged her, but for herself, for the years she had spent making herself small, for believing her dreams were an indulgence she couldn't afford. There was a girl I used to know who learned to walk on soft tiptoe. She held her breath so she wouldn't make a sound. Her voice, intimate and clear, enveloped the hall. It was a testament to how far she had come. She no longer had to shout to be heard. She could whisper, and the world would lean in to listen. When the song finished, a wave of pure emotion washed over the crowd. Then she and the band launched into the powerful, defiant rhythm of River of Souls. The song that had been her declaration of war was now an anthem of victory, and the entire audience sang the chorus with her, a choir of thousands finding their own voice in hers. She sang for 2 hours, pouring out her heart, her history, and her hope. She sang for her mother, for her father, for her grandmother. She sang for the woman who had cried in the laundry room, and for the girl who had given up her Juilliard dream. She was singing her own symphony, a composition of pain and joy, of silence and sound, of injustice, and finally of glorious, triumphant peace. Ilara's story was a powerful reminder that the most formidable weapon against oppression is a voice that dares to speak its truth. She walked into that ballroom, an invisible servant, and walked out a symbol of defiance, not just because she could sing, but because she chose what to sing. She chose her history, her dignity, and her own story over the one a powerful man tried to force upon her. Her journey from the silent halls of a billionaire's mansion to the legendary stage of Carnegie Hall shows us that our worth is not determined by our circumstances, but by the courage we find in our deepest convictions. If Ilara's story of resilience and triumph moved you, please help us share it with the world. Hit that like button to let us know it resonated. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more true life stories that inspire and empower. What part of Ilara's journey hit you the hardest? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.